There's a particular kind of cruelty that wears the face of paperwork. It doesn't arrive with a threat or a raised fist. It comes in an envelope, certified mail, a polite font on county letterhead informing you that your water rights, the ones your grandmother negotiated in 1959, the ones your mother renewed every 7 years without fail, the ones you yourself had paid into, argued for, driven 3 hours to defend at a zoning board meeting with coffee stains on your shirt, have been suspended pending review. Pending review. That's what they said to Myra Solano. Not denied, not revoked, suspended pending review, which meant nobody had to admit they were doing something wrong. It just meant the water stopped. And then everyone sat back and waited to see how long a woman and 60 acres of high desert scrubland could hold on before she came to her senses and sold. I wasn't supposed to be there when it happened. I was passing through on a geological survey. I keep a field log, always have, even when my supervisor tells me it's unnecessary. Old habit from my father, who was a forester, and believed that the only honest account of a place was the one written down before you knew how the story ended. So I wrote it down, all of it. What I didn't expect was that the story would refuse to end the way anyone predicted. The first time I saw the towers, I thought they were broken. That was my honest first impression. Not wonder, not curiosity, just the flat practical assessment of a man who'd spent too many weeks staring at geological formations that had disappointed him. They stood at the upper ridge of Myra Solano's property like something a child had built from memory of a thing they'd half seen in a book. 6 steel-frame cylinders, maybe 14 feet tall each, wrapped in a fine mesh that caught the morning light in a way that made them look almost pretty. Almost. Up close, they were dented in places, patched with what looked like sections cut from old window screen, and the collection pipes at their bases fed into a system of salvaged plastic barrels that sat in the red dirt like mismatched teeth. 2 of the towers were completely still. The mesh on one had torn loose at the top and flapped weakly in the wind. Another had a barrel with a visible crack running along its side, plugged with something gray and rubbery, tire sealant, I'd later learn. I pulled my truck off the county road and wrote in my log, Fog Collection Array Upper Ridge, homemade, 7 units, 2 non-functional, possibly abandoned. I was wrong about abandoned. I was wrong about a lot of things that morning. I'd come to the area on assignment. The survey was focused on groundwater depletion in the high desert basin, a project my department had been quietly lobbying for funding on since before I joined. The basin had been losing aquifer depth at a rate that alarmed the people paid to track such things, and apparently didn't alarm the people paid to issue water licenses, because those licenses kept getting granted, kept getting renewed, kept flowing toward the large agricultural operations that had the lawyers and the lobbying budgets to make sure they did. The Solano property sat at the eastern edge of the basin on land that was technically marginal, too high for easy irrigation, too dry for most conventional crops, too remote for anyone to pay much attention to what grew there or didn't. Which was, I suspected, exactly why Myra Solano had been able to do what she was doing with it for as long as she had. I'd been given a name by the county water office when I'd asked about smallholder situations in the survey area. The clerk had said the name with a particular flatness that I'd recognized, the tone of someone conveying information they found inconvenient. Solano, Myra Solano, she's on a suspended license, has been for 7 months. Then he'd looked back at his screen in a way that clearly ended the conversation. 7 months? I'd written that in my log and circled it twice on the drive out. She was at the base of the ridge when I finally walked up the dirt track from where I'd parked. I'd called out from the gate, a cattle gate wired shut with what appeared to be 3 different generations of fence wire, each color-coded by decade of rust, and waited until a figure appeared from between 2 of the towers. She was shorter than I'd imagined from the name. Late 50s, maybe early 60s, with the kind of posture that comes not from ease but from years of deciding not to be small. Her hair was black shot through with silver, pulled back with what looked like a strip of electrical tape. She wore canvas work pants and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and her forearms were dark from sun and scarred lightly from what I'd guess was fence wire or thorns, the kind of marks that accumulate on a person who works land with their hands. She looked at my truck, then at me, then at the survey equipment in my truck bed. "You from the county?" she said. "Federal Survey, groundwater." She considered this for a moment with her head slightly tilted, like she was listening for something underneath the words. Federal means you can't do anything useful either, she said, but she opened the gate. Her name up close felt exactly right. Mara. There was something in it that matched the land, hard consonants, no wasted sound. She didn't offer coffee. She didn't apologize for not offering it. She walked me up toward the towers and explained what she was doing with the directness of someone who'd explained it many times and had stopped caring whether the person listening found it impressive. The towers were fog collectors. The mesh, a specific grade of polypropylene that she'd sourced after 2 years of research and one failed prototype using nylon window screen, was designed to intercept coastal fog that rolled in from the west during the night and early morning hours, condensing it into droplets that ran down into the collection barrels below. The water was then pumped through a gravity-fed system to her growing beds on the lower terraces of the property. "How much are you getting?" I asked. "Depends on the season, depends on the fog. Right now, maybe 400 liters on a good night, maybe 80 on a bad one." I did the math quickly in my head. It wasn't enough, not for 60 acres, I didn't say that. "What are you growing?" I asked instead. She walked me down the ridge, and I stopped doing math and started just looking. The lower terraces were unlike anything I'd seen on properties in this basin. The beds were narrow and deep, arranged in a pattern that followed the natural contours of the slope rather than running against them. The soil was dark, darker than it had any right to be in high desert scrubland, and the plants growing in it were a mix I couldn't immediately identify. Low-water varietals of things I recognized, some drought-adapted herbs, and stretches of what looked like native ground cover between the rows. "A la irrigation," she said, gesturing to the clay pots I could now see buried at intervals in the beds. "Traditional. The Apache used it in this region. Water seeps slowly from the porous clay directly to the roots. Almost no surface evaporation." "Where did you learn this?" "Books, old accounts. My grandmother's neighbor was a woman whose family had been here since before the county existed." She paused. "She died 12 years ago. I wish I'd asked her more questions." She said it without particular grief, just as a fact about regret, the kind you carry so long it's become part of how you see things. I asked eventually about the suspension. She didn't answer right away. We were sitting on the edge of one of the lower terraces by then, looking down at the farm spread below us in the morning light. It was the kind of view that felt expensive, the kind of view that meant something to the people who showed up at county meetings with developers beside them. "You want the official version or the real version?" she said. "I keep a field log," I said. "Both." The corner of her mouth did something that might have been a smile. "Official version. My license lapsed during a period of regulatory review when the Basin Authority reclassified certain smallholder parcels. Reapplication is pending environmental assessment." "Real version." She was quiet for a long moment. Below us, a hawk made a slow circle over the middle terrace, looking for something in the beds. "Martin Ehrlich bought the Carver property 18 months ago," she said. 300 acres south of here. He wants this parcel, has wanted it for 2 years. He's got a nephew on the county water board." I wrote it down. She watched me write it down. Neither of us said what that meant. "I turned him down twice," she said. "Politely the first time, less politely the second. And then your license got suspended." "And then my license got suspended." She said it evenly, with no drama, the way you say something you've gone over so many times in your head that it's lost its power to make you shake. But her hands, I noticed, were pressed flat against her thighs. Hard, the way you press something down when you don't want it to rise. There were things I noticed about her that I kept adding to the log throughout that morning, not because they were relevant to the groundwater survey, but because my father had taught me that the honest account of a place includes its people, and I've never been able to separate the two. She had a small notebook in her breast pocket that she pulled out whenever she checked something on the farm, not a phone, an actual paper notebook with a cover worn down to bare cardboard. She used it the way I used my log, automatically, without self-consciousness, the way some people breathe. She talked to the plants, not in an obvious way, not in the way that would make you raise an eyebrow, just small muttered comments as she passed, a word here and there. "You're leaning," she said to a tomato vine that had grown at an angle against its stake. She straightened the stake without stopping walking. She didn't complain. I realized this about 2 hours in. In 2 hours of explaining a situation that would have had most people cycling between anger and despair, she had not once complained. She'd stated facts. She'd answered questions. She'd offered her analysis. But she hadn't complained, and the absence of it was louder somehow than complaint would have been. Just before noon, one of the functional towers produced a visible drip. She saw it before I did. Her whole body oriented toward it the way a compass needle swings north, not dramatic, just immediate and total. She crossed to the tower and checked the connection at the barrel's intake, tightened something with a wrench she'd pulled from her back pocket, and stood watching the drip become a thin stream. "That's the good mesh," she said. "The netting I got last fall, it catches better." "How long before the other towers are running?" I asked. "Two are waiting on fittings I ordered 6 weeks ago." She paused. "The supplier sent the wrong size. I'm not sure the right size exists in anything I can afford." She said it the way you say something you haven't figured out yet. Not defeated, just honestly in the middle of the problem. I looked at the 2 non-functional towers. Then I looked at my field equipment in the truck. Then I wrote something in my log that I crossed out. Then I wrote it again. I stayed through lunch, which she didn't offer and I didn't ask for. I stayed because the survey could wait. I had latitude. My supervisor trusted my judgment about where time was worth spending, and I had enough years in the field to know that the most useful data rarely came from where you'd planned to look. But I also stayed because I was trying to understand something that the field log wasn't the right container for. 7 months without water rights, in high desert, 60 acres, and she was still here. The farm was not thriving, I could see that clearly. The beds were thinner than they should have been, some of them bare, the spacing between producing plants wider than optimal. The yields were probably a fraction of what the property could produce under normal conditions. She was running at reduced capacity, reduced income, reduced everything. And yet, the fog towers were working. Not all of them, not at full capacity, not enough, but working. The ALA system was conserving what she had. The native ground cover between the rows was holding moisture in the soil. She had adapted in ways that were specific, considered, and resourceful, and she had done it in the 7 months since the envelope arrived. I asked her, finally, what she'd thought when the water was turned off. She took a moment before she answered. "I thought about my grandmother," she said. "She grew up in a place where the water was controlled by people who didn't care if her family drank or didn't drink. Not that different from here, if you want to be honest about it." She looked at the towers. "She told me once that the worst thing you can do to a person is make them dependent on your generosity, because then the cruelty is built into the relationship and nobody has to admit they're being cruel." "What did she do, your grandmother?" "She built a cistern," Mara said. "With her mother and her sisters and 2 neighbors over 3 weeks, they dug it by hand." She said it simply, the way you say something that hasn't stopped being true. I wrote it down. At 2 in the afternoon, a truck appeared on the county road below, a newer truck, white, with a logo on the side I couldn't read from the ridge. It slowed at the gate, didn't stop, moved on. Mara watched it without expression. "Alex people," she said. "They do that maybe once a week, just to see if the cars are still here." I looked at her. "They're waiting," she said. She turned back to the tower with the torn mesh and picked up a roll of the fine netting she'd been working with before I arrived. She began measuring a patch against the gap, pressing the corners into place with her thumb to see how it would sit. "For what?" I said, though I already knew. "For me to leave," she said. She didn't say it with bitterness. She said it the way you state the weather. Here is the condition we are operating in. Here is what's falling on us today. Then she started cutting the mesh to size. I came back 3 weeks later. That surprised me, if I'm honest. I don't generally go back. My work moves me from one survey zone to the next, and I've trained myself not to attach to places in the way that makes leaving difficult. My supervisor once told me, not unkindly, that I had the emotional commitment of a migratory bird. I could be fully present in a place and then be gone from it without apparent grief. He wasn't entirely wrong. But I came back to the Solano property. I told myself it was because I had follow-up data points to collect, which was true, and which was also not the whole truth, and I'm enough of my father's son to put that in the log. I'd spent the 3 weeks between visits doing something that was technically outside my job description, but not, I felt, outside what the job was for. I'd pulled the county water board meeting minutes for the past 2 years, public record, available if you knew where to look, which most people don't. I'd read through them carefully. I'd made a list of dates and cross-referenced them with property transaction records in the basin. I'd written up a summary that I'd given to 2 colleagues at the University Extension Office who worked on water rights policy. I hadn't told Mara. I wasn't sure what I had yet, and I didn't want to hand her something that turned out to be nothing. What I had, I was increasingly sure, was not nothing, but it needed someone with more legal standing than a federal surveyor to make it mean something. In the meantime, I drove back out to the ridge. The first thing I noticed was a new barrel. It was at the base of Tower 4, one of the 2 that had been waiting on fittings. The barrel was mismatched with the others, blue where they were gray, larger, and it had a visible weld seam on one side that suggested someone had repaired rather than replaced it. The collection pipe was connected with what appeared to be a custom-fitted coupling, metal with a slight greenish tinge that meant copper. Tower 4 was running. I stood at the gate and looked at it for a long moment before I went in. Mara was in the lower terraces when I arrived, kneeling in the dirt between 2 rows with a hand trowel. She looked up, registered that it was me, and went back to what she was doing. "Tower 4, I said. "Neighbor," she said. "Ruben Archuleta 2 miles north, he's a welder. He came by last week." She worked the trowel around the base of a plant, loosening the soil without disturbing the roots, a careful, practiced motion. "I didn't ask him to, he just showed up." "Just showed up." "He said he'd heard I was having some trouble with fittings." She didn't look up. "He had a cousin in Albuquerque who works at a plumbing supply, apparently." There was something in her voice that she was keeping very level. Not gratitude, or not only gratitude. Something more complicated, the thing you feel when someone's kindness gets past the wall you've built precisely to keep kindness from making you feel how hard things actually are. I wrote in my log, T4 operational, community sourcing, note effect. She'd expanded 2 of the lower beds. I saw it as I walked down the ridge. 2 sections that had been bare on my first visit were now planted, the soil dark and visibly moist around the bases of young seedlings. The plants were small, barely a few inches high, but they were in the ground and standing. "Where's the water coming from?" I asked. "The 4th tower plus the redistribution." She'd stood and was dusting her hands on her pants, watching me clock the changes. "I recalculated the system. I was losing about 12% through one of the secondary pipes, a fitting that was degraded, fixed it, recovered about 50 liters a night." "You were losing 12% for how long?" "Probably since February." She said it without inflection. Then, "I know. I should have caught it sooner." "That's not what I meant." She looked at me then, a quick, assessing look, the kind that decides something. "I know what you meant," she said, but more gently. Inside the small equipment shed at the edge of the property, a corrugated metal structure that she used for storage and tool maintenance, she had pinned a large sheet of paper to the wall. It was a hand-drawn diagram of the entire water system. Towers, pipes, barrels, the gravity feed lines down to the terraces, the ala placements in each bed. Annotated in pencil, some sections were drawn where plans had changed. It looked like something you'd find in a university engineering department, except that it had been made by a woman alone in a shed with whatever paper she had available. "You drew all this?" I said. "I needed to be able to see the whole thing at once," she said. "When you're in the middle of it, you miss things." I stood looking at the diagram for a long time. She'd included not just what existed, but what she was planning, dotted lines indicating proposed new collection points, question marks at junctions where she wasn't sure yet. The future was on the map alongside the present, uncertain, but already being worked out. "Tower 2, I said, the one that still had the torn mesh and no collection barrel. "I'm waiting on a donor barrel from a restaurant supply place in Las Cruces. Their manager said 2 weeks. That was," she counted, 9 days ago. "And the mesh." She hesitated. It was the first hesitation I'd seen from her that wasn't about choosing words. It was about something that had a weight to it. "I ordered more of the good netting, the polypropylene." She paused. "It didn't come through budget." I should not have done what I did next. Strictly speaking, professionally speaking, I had no business involving myself in a private citizen's infrastructure situation. My survey work had a defined scope. I was on the property in a professional capacity, not a personal one. My supervisor would have told me, not unkindly, that I was a migratory bird trying to build a nest, and that it would end in confusion for everyone. But I had in the bed of my truck approximately 40 meters of polypropylene fog collection mesh that I'd requisitioned for a secondary project that had just been deprioritized due to budget cuts. The mesh was still government property, technically. What I was allowed to do with it in the field, in service of related research objectives, and groundwater recovery through atmospheric collection was, one could argue, adjacent to my survey's scope, was something I had a certain latitude to determine. One could argue. I went back to my truck and got the mesh. Mara was at the door of the shed when I came back with it. She looked at the roll, then at me. "That's survey equipment," she said. "Mesh," I said, "for atmospheric moisture assessment." She looked at me for a long moment. Her expression did several things in sequence. Recognition, resistance, something that moved through her face and then got collected and put away. "I don't take charity," she said. It wasn't hostile, it was just a fact she was stating. "It's a loan," I said. "For research purposes, I'll need documentation of the collection data." She looked at the mesh, then at Tower 2. "You'll need it back," she said. "Probably not," I said. "The project was cut." A very long pause. "You're not good at lying," she said. "My father was a forester," I said. "He believed in written records of the truth." She took the mesh. We spent the afternoon installing it. This was not in my field log as planned activity. I wrote it under unexpected observations and described it in terms of proximity assessment and practical engagement with subjects' collection infrastructure. And if my supervisor ever read it carefully, he would probably laugh, but he would understand. She worked with an efficiency that I found difficult to match, not because she was faster exactly, but because every movement she made was purposeful. There was no wasted motion. She didn't deliberate at the moment of action because she'd already deliberated. The decision of where to cut, how to attach, what angle to set the mesh at relative to prevailing fog direction, all of that had been worked out before we started, in her head or in that notebook in her pocket, and now it was just execution. I handed her things. I held the frame when she needed a second set of hands. At one point she asked me to climb the ladder to feed the attachment line through the top ring, and I did it with less grace than she would have managed, but without dropping anything, which I counted as success. "Where did you learn the engineering?" I asked up on the ladder. "I didn't," she said below. "I learned to read and to ask questions and to be wrong and start over." "That's engineering." "Don't flatter me." "I'm not, that's literally the definition." A pause from below. "Feed the line through and come down." By late afternoon, Tower 2 had mesh. It wasn't connected to a barrel yet. The Las Cruces barrel was still theoretical, but the collection surface was in place. In the right conditions, the mesh would begin intercepting fog that night. The water would drip from the bottom edge and fall into the dirt, wasted until the barrel arrived, but the mesh would show whether this position was producing. We stood back and looked at it. The afternoon light was going amber, the way it does in high desert when the day starts deciding to end. The 6 towers stood along the ridge with it, 4 functional, 1 ready, 1 still waiting. In the light, they looked less improvised than they had on my first visit. They looked like something that belonged there. "If all 6 run," I said, "what does that give you?" She'd done this math already. I could tell from how fast the answer came. On a good night, maybe 700 liters on the median. 450. Is that enough? She was quiet for a moment. The honest pause of someone who doesn't want to overstate or understate. "For the beds I have now, yes, mostly." Another pause. "Not for what the farm could be, not for full production." "But survivable." She looked at the towers. "Survivable," she said. It was not a small word. She did not say it like a small word. Ruben Archuleta came by at 5. He was a wide man in his late 40s, with hands that announced his trade before he opened his mouth. He nodded at me in the polite, measured way of someone who is deciding what to make of a stranger, and then turned to Mara with a question about the copper fitting on Tower 4. They talked in a mix of English and Spanish that I only partially followed, moving between technical and personal with the ease of people who have known each other a long time and know which register to use for which topic. He'd brought a casserole, which he set on a fence post while they talked and did not mention, and which Mara also did not mention, but which she picked up when he left. He looked at Tower 2 and the new mesh on the way out. "That looks good," he said, to me, not to her, assessing, approving. "It's a start," I said. He considered me for another moment. "You coming back?" he said. "Yes," I said, and I hadn't decided that until I said it. He nodded like that was the right answer and got in his truck. I sat on the tailgate of my own truck as the light went down and wrote field notes until it was too dark to write easily. What I was noticing, what I was trying to get down accurately before the day's distance distorted it, was something I didn't have good professional vocabulary for. The survey was about groundwater depletion, aquifer levels, drawdown rates, recharge ratios, numbers, the kind of data that fits into tables and tells a clear story to people who know how to read tables. What was happening on this ridge didn't fit a table. A woman had had her water shut off by people who wanted her land. In response, she had read everything she could find about moisture in the air. She had built structures to catch fog. She had recalculated and patched and adapted and pushed through 7 months of diminishing resources with enough precision that her farm was still alive, was in fact in some ways more sophisticated than it had been before the crisis, because crisis had forced her to understand it more deeply than she would have if everything had been easy. Her neighbor had shown up without being asked, because that is what neighbors do when they know what's real and when what's real is unjust. She'd taken mesh from a stranger because she was smart enough to know that survival sometimes requires accepting help without calling it help. The towers were catching fog. It was not a table, but it was true. As I was leaving, Mara was at the gate. She had the casserole dish under one arm and her notebook in her hand. "The water board meeting," she said. "Next month, I'm told they're reviewing licenses." I looked at her. "If someone had documentation," she said carefully, "about the pattern of license suspensions in the basin and the property transactions that followed them." She was watching me with that level, assessing gaze. "That would be useful to have at a meeting like that." I kept my face neutral. Hypothetically, I said. "If someone had done that kind of cross-referencing, they might want to make sure it got into the hands of someone with standing to present it." She nodded slowly. "I know a water rights attorney in Santa Fe," she said. "She's been looking for a pattern case." I thought about the summary I'd given to my colleagues at the extension office. I thought about what they'd said when they'd read it. "I'll send you something," I said, "as a research contact." She looked at me for a long moment, then she opened the gate. "Drive safe," she said. "It's dark on that road." She went back to her farm. The fog was already coming in from the west. The barrel arrived from Las Cruces on a Tuesday. I know this because Mara sent me a message she texted with the clipped efficiency of someone who treats their phone as a tool and not a companion. That said only, "Barrel here. Tower 2 connected tonight. And then, after a pause, you should come for the board meeting. Next week." I was 400 miles away, mid-survey on a different basin. I rearranged my schedule. My supervisor asked no questions, which I appreciated. I drove out on a Friday, a week before the meeting. Not because the meeting needed me there a week early, but because the log needed completing, and because there are some things you don't want to read as a summary afterward when you could have been there to watch them happen in real time. All 6 towers were running when I arrived. I know that sounds like a sentence that should have more ceremony around it. I've gone back and reread my log from that morning, and I wrote it exactly that way, all 6 towers running. 8:47 hours. Fog moderate, wind from the west at approximately 8 mph. Collection appearing to be strong. My father would have approved of the precision. He would have also told me I was underselling it. All 6 towers, after 8 months running. Mara was at the upper ridge checking the connections on Tower 5, and when she heard my truck, she looked down the slope at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Not triumph, that was too loud for her. Not relief, exactly, that was too soft. It was something precise. The expression of a person who calculated a thing was possible, worked toward it for a long time without certainty, and has now arrived at the point where the calculation and the reality are the same number. She held up 5 fingers, then one more. 6. She'd redesigned the lower terrace layout. This was the thing that stopped me cold when I walked down from the ridge, not the towers, which I'd been watching in my mind for weeks, but the terraces, which had changed in a way I hadn't anticipated. Two of the bare sections I'd seen on my first visit were now fully planted. One section she'd converted to a different system entirely. A series of small, shallow basins she called waffle beds, a technique she'd read about in accounts of traditional southwestern farming that held water at the surface long enough to soak in before evaporating. "This wasn't in the diagram," I said, looking at the waffle beds. "The diagram was wrong," she said. "I changed my mind about the grade." "When?" "About 6 weeks ago. Reuben helped me reshape the beds. His son came too." She paused. "His son is 15. He asked about the mesh. I showed him the research." Another pause. "He wants to do a science project on atmospheric moisture collection." She said it like it was a footnote, like a 15-year-old deciding to study fog collection because of what he saw on her ridge was not a remarkable thing to have put in motion. I wrote it down. There were other people on the property that morning. That was new. A woman from 2 properties east, whose name I didn't catch, was working in one of the expanded beds, transplanting seedlings with a careful hand. A man I hadn't seen before was doing something to the pipe connections on Tower 3 with a wrench. A teenager, Reuben's son, I guessed from the age, was measuring the mesh on Tower 6 with a tape measure and writing numbers in a notebook. It wasn't a crowd. It wasn't a movement. It was maybe 4 people on 60 acres on a Friday morning doing practical things because they had chosen to be there. I watched Mara moving between them. She stopped to answer a question, to show a technique, to look at something that the woman in the beds was pointing at. She was not the center of the space in the way that some people make themselves the center, loudly, by demanding attention. She was the center the way a root system is the center of a garden, underground, structural, not visible but determinative. The water rights attorney arrived just before noon. Her name was Elena Vasquez, and she drove a practical car with a car seat in the back and a box of documents on the passenger seat. She was younger than I'd expected, mid-30s, with the kind of tired, alert expression of someone who has 3 cases and a toddler and is running on principle and black coffee. She and Mara sat at the table in the equipment shed, the table Mara used for seed sorting and tool organization, and which was now cleared and holding 2 cups of water and a stack of papers. And I sat outside on a crate and wrote in my log and tried to give them space while remaining close enough to be asked questions if needed. I heard enough. The summary I'd compiled had been useful, more than useful. Elena had cross-referenced it with 3 additional cases in neighboring counties that showed the same pattern: license suspension, followed by property offers, followed by sale under pressure or legal expense. My case wasn't the strongest data point, but it was part of a shape that was becoming undeniable. "The board meeting," Elena said, "is a hearing technically. That means there's a public comment period." "I know," Mara said. "If you speak." "I'm going to speak. They'll have counsel. They'll try to make it procedural." "Let them try." A pause. I heard Elena set down her cup. "I want to be honest with you," she said. "This meeting probably doesn't reinstate your license, not immediately. These things move slowly." "I know," Myra said again. "But if it goes on the record, if your situation goes on the record alongside these other cases, it builds something. It builds towards something." "How long?" A silence. "I don't know," Elena said. "A year, maybe 2, if we file well and document everything and don't make mistakes." A much longer silence. "My grandmother dug a cistern by hand," Mara said. "It took 3 weeks." I don't know what Elena's face did then. I only know that they kept talking, and the talking had a different quality to it afterward, not hopeful exactly, but directed. Aimed. The way a river is aimed when it finds the lowest path through rock. I came inside when they were done, and Myra handed me a cup of water, actual tap water, I assumed from the small reserve tank she kept for indoor use, and I drank it and looked at the diagram on the wall. It had been updated, new lines in pencil, a proposed 7th tower location on the northern edge of the ridge, where she'd apparently assessed that fog frequency was higher than her original placement. Dotted lines extending the waffle bed system to 2 more terrace sections. A note in the margin in her handwriting that said, "Winter fog season begins Oct. Estimate 20% increase in collection." She was planning for next season. She was planning a 7th tower while fighting for her license, while managing a farm on reduced water, while hosting an attorney and a teenager with a tape measure, and a neighbor doing pipework on Tower 3. I don't know what to call that exactly. My log says strategic prioritization under sustained pressure because that's the vocabulary I have. But what I saw was something older and harder and more worth witnessing than that phrase suggests. The board meeting was the following Thursday. I drove into town the night before and stayed at a motel that smelled of old carpet and industrial cleaner, and had a vending machine that ate my dollar without producing a result. I lay on the bed and read through the meeting minutes I'd collected again, cross-referencing the dates, making sure I hadn't gotten anything wrong. My phone lit up at 11, a message from Mara, can't sleep. Checking the towers. I wrote back anything. A pause, then 4 is running well, wind shifted, 2 might be slow tonight. Then, after another pause, I've been thinking about what I say tomorrow. Do you know yet? I wrote back. The response took a while, long enough that I thought she'd put the phone down and gone back to her towers. Then, I'm going to say that the water was mine before the county existed, and that I built something to collect it from the air when they took it from the ground, and that if they think that's remarkable, they should think harder about what it took. I read that 3 times. That's the right thing to say, I wrote back. Yes, she said, good night. The water board occupied a beige meeting room in the county building that smelled of burnt coffee and recycled air. There were 7 board members, 5 of whom I recognized from the meeting minutes, and a county attorney at a side table, and a man in a good jacket near the back who I recognized from the Aeolic Company's website. The public comment period lasted 45 minutes. There were 8 speakers. Most of them were brief. Neighboring landholders, a representative from an agricultural co-op, Elena Vasquez presenting documentation in the precise language of someone who knows that every word is on the record. Myra was the last speaker. She stood at the podium, not a natural place for her, I thought, watching her square herself to it, and she spoke for 6 minutes. I know because I timed it in my log. She did not use theatrical language. She did not appeal to sympathy. She stated facts. The timeline of her license suspension, its correspondence with Aeolic's acquisition of the neighboring property, the pattern of similar suspensions Elena had documented. She stated what she had done in response: the fog towers, the ALA system, the waffle beds, the redesigned irrigation. She said the word fog 11 times, and each time it landed differently. Then she said, I have been farming this land for 22 years. My grandmother farmed land that people wanted to take from her and did take from her, and she never stopped working the next piece. I am not going to stop. I am not going to sell. I am going to bring more water out of the air than you think is possible, because that is what this land has always required, and because the people who tried to wait me out don't understand what they're waiting against. She paused. The room was very quiet. The water belongs to the land, she said. The land is mine. I just wanted to say that plainly for the record. She stepped back from the podium and sat down. Nobody said anything for a moment that was long enough to have a shape. They didn't reinstate her license at the meeting. Elena had been right about that. The board voted to extend the review period pending further assessment, which was, as Elena explained afterward in the parking lot in the flat voice of someone who has learned to say disappointing things without excess softness, better than it might have been, which was denial. Not a victory, not a defeat, a continuation. Mara stood in the parking lot while Elena explained the next steps. The man in the good jacket came out of the building and got into a vehicle without looking at anyone. Ruben's truck was in the lot. He'd been in the room, he and his son, the son still with the tape measure in his jacket pocket. They stood nearby. I wrote in my log, meeting concluded. License status unchanged. Legal process initiated. Collection infrastructure, 6 towers operational. Case on public record. I looked at what I'd written. I crossed out the last line and rewrote it. Her words are on the record now. That was more accurate. She drove back to the farm that afternoon, and I followed her because she'd said there was something she wanted to show me before I left for good this time. The survey was concluding. My time in the basin was ending, and we both understood this without saying it. The something she wanted to show me was Tower 7. Not the proposed dotted line tower from the diagram. The actual Tower 7, steel frame cylinder, polypropylene mesh, collection pipe, salvaged barrel at the base, already assembled. already standing at the northern edge of the ridge where she'd noted higher fog frequency. "When did you build this?" I said. "Started it 2 days after the barrel arrived from Las Cruces," she said. "Finished yesterday." She'd built a new tower while preparing for a county hearing, while hosting an attorney and a welder and a teenager with a tape measure. She'd built it the way you do a thing when you've decided the situation is not going to dictate the pace of your work, deliberately, steadily, without announcing it. "It's not connected yet," she said. "I need a fitting, different size than the others. The terrain affects the angle." She looked at it with the particular expression of someone already solving the next problem. "Maybe another week." I stood looking at Tower 7 for a while. Then I looked at the other 6, spread along the ridge in the late afternoon light, the mesh catching small light where the evening moisture was already beginning to collect. 7 towers, 1 woman, 8 months of a county-approved version of Siege. "What's the collection estimate?" I said. "All 7. She thought about it, not for long. "On a good night," she said. 800 liters, maybe more if the northern exposure is what I think it is. "And the farm, full capacity." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the beds below, the waffle sections, the olives buried in their rows, the young seedlings in the expanded plots. "Not full," she said. "Not yet, but—" She paused. The pause had something in it that wasn't hesitation exactly. More like the breath you take before saying something you've decided to say carefully. "Enough. For now, enough." She wrote something in her notebook. The small worn thing, carbide cover rubbed to the cardboard beneath. She wrote it without looking up. I didn't ask what she wrote. I have my own log. She has hers. Some things belong in one record and not another. I left the property just before dark. At the gate, I looked back at the ridge. All 6 towers were visible in the fading light. Tower 7 was there too, a darker shape at the far edge, unconnected but standing. The fog was rolling in from the west, slow and thick, the way it moves when it means to stay. In the morning, I knew the barrels would be heavy. Mara was already back at the upper terrace, moving between the towers with her notebook. She didn't wave. She was checking something, a connection, a barrel level, a reading she needed before the light was completely gone. I wrote in my log, property, day of departure, all infrastructure functional, legal process ongoing. 7th collection unit standing, pre-operational, owner present and working. I sat with the pen in my hand for a moment. Then I added, the fog is coming in. It will be a good night. I closed the log and drove. Behind me in the dark, the mesh was catching what the air offered, and the barrels were filling, drop by drop, the way they always had, quietly, persistently, without waiting for permission. 6 weeks later, I received a message, a photo, no caption. 7 towers in full morning light, every collection pipe running. I never wrote back. Some things don't need a response. The survey report noted, in an appendix, an emerging model of atmospheric water collection in high-desert smallholder operations, with documented potential for basin-level replication. It named no names. It included precise collection data from a property in the Eastern Basin that had demonstrated statistically significant yield under conditions of conventional water scarcity. The appendix ran 4 pages. It was, as far as I know, the most useful thing I ever wrote.